parallels between the three Canto 10s, Canto 9s, and Canto 10s. The every Canto 9 is like the entrance. It's a demarcation point between getting really into the depths of things. So in the Inferno, Canto 9 is the entrance to lower hell, where the real baddies are. The real people that it's called willful sin. People who would have deliberately basically sinned, versus sins of what he calls incontinence, which is like undeliberately messing up, like just getting so overshadowed by something that you just do something sinful, but not like deliberately, premeditatedly sinning and not repenting. So it's called the city of Dis. That's part of it. That happens, and that kind of leads you into. It's mostly really about fraud, but there's a few other ones mixed in there too. And then on Purgatory, it's the entrance to, you get to leave the sort of waiting room of Purgatory, which is the Purgatory beach in the beginning of the mountain, and then you get to enter Purgatory, where you can actually begin to purge your sins, and there's a big gate, and you have, like, an angel lets them through this big gate, and then they go, to the first terrace. There's 7 terraces for 7 sort of, quote-unquote, deadly sins. First terrace is pride, which is, so the entrance is Canto 9, and then the terrace starts in Canto 10, and then in Paradise, it's the like leaving the shadow of the earth, which is the heaven of the sun. Entrance to highest heaven, even though like there's really no hierarchy in heaven. They're all like, we're all equally in the mind of God, and we just have different perspectives, so we're not actually in a hierarchy, but they kind of are. So it's one of those, Paradise is all about like paradoxes. And let's see, so this is, and then it leads you into these big themes, which I would argue, and many have argued. Mostly, I'm citing the Teodelinda Barolini in her website, free website, Digital Dante, and then I also have her book called The Undivine Comedy. That is a lot of where some of the screenshots are from. And then I also have loved the book Reading Dante by Prue Shaw, and also have a few other ones too. But so Teodelinda is really into the idea of tracing this through line through the poem of his obsession with Odysseus and Daedalus, and to some extent Nimrod too, about comparing Dante to them, and saying that they're kind of like these anti-heroes that are, Odysseus is the known, like, kind of, Odysseus and Daedalus are known tricksters. They're kind of like this idea of the person who survives on their wits and wiles and kind of like crosses some lines with them, and it's just like kind of prideful, but just so like, I can prove that I can do this with my mind, and I can trick anyone and get anything, and sort of cross the boundaries of God and what humans are supposed to be able to do, and therefore get punished. We see this with Daedalus creating wings that allow his son to fly, Icarus, but then the wings melt because they're just wax, so he goes too close to the sun, loses his son. In Dante, Dante writes this sort of epilogue for Odysseus that's not in Homer, because he couldn't actually read Homer because they forgot how to read Greek, so he had really only read the Aeneid, which is in Latin, but he knows about Odysseus, and Odysseus was this trickster, and he gives Odysseus this ending that Odysseus didn't, wasn't satisfied at home, or maybe he didn't even go home at the end, and he goes to say, well, okay, I've conquered all these I've gone through all these adventures, and I'm gonna be the first person to go, kind of like Star Trek, to go to horizons where no one has been before. And so he's gonna go all the way to the southern hemisphere via boat and get to the mountain of Purgatory. Now, in the Odyssey, unbeknownst to Dante, that Dante doesn't actually go to the underworld, but he does this necromancy thing where he brings a lot of souls up from the underworld and talks to them. And Aeneas actually does go physically into the underworld. So, anyway, which is a big thing. Aeneas, at the beginning of the Inferno, Dante says, I'm not Aeneas and I'm not St. Paul. And Aeneas is a sort of model of piety and self-restraint. And that's why he thinks that Virgil is a good role model for him, a good guide from him through Inferno and Purgatory. And then St. Paul is going back to this ecstatic theme. St. Paul had this wild vision where, and he says, I'm not sure if I was in my body or not, but I went to heaven temporarily and saw the face of God and had this experience of God. So it's kind of heretical in Catholic doctrine to say that you physically went to heaven, but they let St. Paul do it since he was one of the big founders of the church in the eventual split from Judaism, where he declared Jesus to be the Messiah versus just a prophet. So he's a big Dante's continually referencing St. Paul, and he's kind of slyly saying that he's better than St. Paul because he says, I know I was in my body. And there's continual references to him, everyone being like, oh, you have your body. You're not just a wafy spirit, or having this sort of out-of-body spiritual experience. So anyway, so there's this big theme throughout the whole thing of is this a constructed reality? And what are the limits of fraud? Is Dante sinful because he's deliberately tricking us through constructing this whole thing? So, in the Inferno, fraud, it's going back to this idea that he gets from Aristotle, that the worst thing a person can do is use their rational faculties and their free will, that was the divine gift, to betray people. So that's why fraud's way down there. And Lucifer is the ultimate betrayer because he betrayed his spiritual benefactor, which was God. And so was Judas. And then Dante always has a classical parallel, a biblical and a classical parallel. So the parallel is Cassius and Brutus betraying Caesar. And then Purgatory, in this Terrace of Pride, has this whole discourse on, is art trickery? Is using language to create creations that mimic God's creations blasphemous? Is it too high on the hog? For this, he has an example of Arachne, the classical example of Arachne, who was this woman who said, oh, I'm a better weaver than Athena. And she was a damn good weaver, but she was too prideful. And so then Athena turned her into a spider so that she could weave webs forever. So it's good. You gotta check your ego. And then there's this whole theme of the impermanence of achievement. And this whole discourse on Cimabue being replaced by Giotto, and how ephemeral fame is. And then in Paradise, it's the limits of language to convey the ineffable glory of God.